Words from the Hebrew Bible. Words of faith from Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But the earth became chaos and emptiness, and darkness came over the face of the deep. Yet the Spirit of God was brooding over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Light, be." And light was. God saw that light was good and separated light from darkness. God called the light day and the darkness night. Evening came and morning followed, the first day. Then God said, "Let us make an expanse between the waters, separate water from water." So it was. God made the expanse and separated the water above the expanse from the water below. God called the expanse above sky. Evening came and morning followed, the second day. Then God said, "Waters under the sky be gathered in one place. Dry ground appear." So it was. God called the ground earth, and the gathering of the waters sea. And God saw this was good. And then God said, "Earth, produce vegetation, plants that scatter their own seeds, and every kind of fruit tree that bears fruit with its own seeds in it." And so it was. The earth brought forth every kind of plant that bears seed, and every kind of fruit tree on earth that bears fruit with seed in it. And God saw that this was good. Evening came, morning followed, the third day. Then God said, "Now let there be lights in the expanse of the sky. Separate day from night. Let them mark the signs and seasons, days and years, and serve as luminaries in the sky, shedding light upon the earth." So it was. God made the two great lights, the greater one to illumine the day, and the lesser one to illumine the night. Then God made the stars as well, placing them in the expanse of the sky, to shed light on earth, to govern day and night, and separate light from darkness. And God saw that this was good. Evening came and morning followed, the fourth day. For the glorious revelation of God in creation, we give thanks.
May I speak in the name of God, the love maker, light bearer and life giver. Amen. Let there be light. But what kind of light, as John O'Donoghue reflects? One of the puzzles Christians have sometimes set themselves is to work out what light is referred to in the very first few verses of the Bible. Because apart from modern light forms, we're used to thinking of light from the sun and the moon, which in the Genesis account only come later. Various possibilities have been suggested, therefore, by different theologians. Some, such as Ephraim of Syria, have suggested the light was a pillar of fire. We hear that later in the story. Or like Basil of Caesarea, that it was the essence of the sun without its actual substance. Or even that the light came from the angels, in the case of Augustine of Hippo. However, insofar as you might want to give an answer to that, I think I would go with the Orthodox Church's understanding of the uncreated light of God in God's self. For when we come to the first chapter of Genesis, we are speaking above all of divine mystery, depth, purpose, and ultimate meaning. Not a literal or even a limited symbolic explanation of creation. Rather, like that reading from John O'Donoghue, the nature of Genesis chapter 1 is poetic and prayerful, and to understand it otherwise is to make what scholars call a genre mistake. It is poetry and prayer seeking to lead us into sacredness. For above all, such texts, like the psalm as well, magic psalm, are designed to renew our sense of wonder and our participation in divine creation and our role as priests of creation. Priests of God's creation. Is that a key element of how we understand our following as followers of Jesus? Too often, I think, priesthood has been restricted to human activities alone, where it's not been extended even beyond churchy life. Even the biblical phrase, the priesthood of all believers, is also not entirely helpful, as it tends to emphasize human, or for many people today, human churchy affirmations, rather than a sharing in the holy creativity of God, which begins long before humans. As our second hymn said, mortals, come and join in the song that's already present in creation. So much greater and deeper than human and certainly churchy life. And that is the full priestly calling of humanity, which is embodied in our readings today. One of my favorite definitions of a priest is one who handles holy things. Of course, that relates to bread and wine, which we'll share today, as well as baptismal water and holy oils and other features associated with ordained ministry. But it applies much more broadly to the many holy things which a priest and others handle in their life and ministry, not least to the really truly holy human things of celebration, suffering, and transformation, which we encounter in daily sharing in the lives of others. So in that way, each of us are not just priests as believers, but priests of creation, when we share the holy things which are at the heart of our lives and journey together in God's creativity. So each of us, like a priest in worship, can help to share our holy human things, to name them, celebrate them, or lament them, and offer them up, as we do today with these things that we have before us. And so doing, to participate in God's continuing work of creativity, reconciliation, and renewing of life, which was there long before human beings were here, and will probably be long before after we've gone, whether or not we destroy ourselves on this planet or not. That's the heart of the sacrament of communion we share today for me, because this sacrament of communion is a holy and visible symbol of that divine priestly work in which we're called to share in every moment of our lives. And what we do today here focuses that, so we do it at every moment of our lives. Can we see ourselves as priests of creation? As we begin our Sunday worship in this season of creation, it is wonderful to be reminded of our calling to be priests of creation as foundations of our lives and ministry. Because the season of creation is not just an opportunity, and that's good, not just an opportunity to talk about ecological concerns and to act upon them. Instead, this season also invites us into a deeper awareness and sharing in the creativity of God in God's self, in all aspects of life. And that's the point of this great chapter, Genesis chapter 1, which is so misused and abused. It is not, and it never was for the great theologians of the Christian church, intended as an accurate scientific description of the creation of the universe. That is a genre mistake made by fundamentalists and conservatives and made by atheistic humanists who also can't get their heads around poetry and prayer. Nor is it set at the very beginning of the Bible as a set of moral instructions for earth care. The Bible is not that. Even though it's got a command at the end of Genesis 1 to care for the earth, and we take that seriously. It's also certainly not a once and for all series of actions which God has done, and there you are, we just get on with it. No, its original and abiding purpose is to declare this sacred presence of God from the first moment of creation and to invite us to celebrate it and continue it, sharing in it as priests of creation and co-creators with God. So, can we see Genesis 1 not as a text, and certainly not as a bit of science, but as a hymn, a psalm, a prayer poem like that of John O'Donoghue, or a great litany in which we're invited to share? Because if you look at the text, and if you look at a lot of the texts actually in the Bible, they're actually born out of worship. And if we miss that and take it out of worship and examine it as if it's sort of a doctrinal text, we miss the point, as we do with other parts of the scriptures. Its liturgical shape and origins are obvious, really, if you have eyes to see. Indeed, not for nothing is Genesis chapter 1 part of what scholars call the priestly narratives in the Hebrew scriptures, deliberately called priestly because they're written by the priests and they're part of this sacred understanding of joining in the sacred celebration of God, particularly in the temple. It is almost certainly actually this first text much later than a lot of other things in the Hebrew scriptures, and it seeks to place all those other things in a unifying and life-giving whole. And so it sits with other creation-oriented scriptures, those amazing texts and verses in the later parts of Isaiah, for example, which emerged out of Israel's exile and restoration, and which speak not just of the God of one place and one set of people, but the God of the whole universe in all its extraordinary diversity, not just human beings, but everything, from the sea monsters to whatever else is around us and beyond us. Stylistically, it's also pretty obvious it's got a place in worship rather than education or moral instruction. Because just look at the way in which Genesis 1 is divided into segments, each of those days. And each of them concludes, doesn't it, with a repeated refrain, and God saw it was good, and there was evening and morning. Is not this, therefore, a great prayer of praise and thanksgiving, declaring God's creative works? And can we imagine each section, a bit like our own liturgies at times, to be recited by a priest or cantor, like Kathy did earlier with part of it, and then we responded, like with the psalm? In a similar way, in the temple and originally the priest or cantor might have sung part of this or said it, and then the refrains are responded to by the congregation or the choir in response, as we did with Psalm 8 and some other sections today. Because if so, we can therefore see, particularly in our communion, that what we do is very much the same. Indeed, a key element of what we do is not something new, but it's something renewed. But it's not new because it's something that has been done throughout the ages, down the centuries in different ways by people of faith, but before that by the birds and the insects and everything else that gives praise, as St. Francis said, to creation. It's an eternal offering, not just of human beings, but through the songs of birds and cries of animals and every living part of creation. To me, too often in recent centuries, and the Reformation didn't help, the sacrament of communion has been limited to its human components. And they're very important, aren't they, of course? Not least the depth of fellowship in communion, which our Reformed traditions rightly affirm. However, the sacrament of communion, in my view, is the door to the sacred in all that is visible and invisible. That's the big picture and the big tradition. In all that was and will be, and in the unfolding work of creation and creativity in which all creatures are called to take their part. And that is the fuller meaning of the bread and wine. Not just bread and wine reminding us of Jesus, but bread and wine reminding us of every aspect of material existence. Because Jesus became flesh, became incarnate, so that the sacredness of God in all things could be reflected and seen even in human form. Hard to believe sometimes that human beings are full of God's sacredness, but we are. So they're living symbols, these things before us here, not just of bread and wine or human bodies and blood, but of animals, birds, insects, plants, and everything that has gone to make them up and is connected with them. So as we celebrate this sacrament of communion, we celebrate all of those things as holy things, just as priests in the temple did long ago. For we give praise and thanksgiving for the work of creation and recreation. That's part of what Jesus is about throughout time and space, in the universe and beyond, in the presence of God, here as before, now as in the time to come. And if I sound like an Orthodox priest, it's because I think the Orthodox who helped give us the season of creation have something to share with us. Understanding ourselves as priests of creation, I think, is one of the gifts, the ecumenical gifts of the season of creation, because our Christian traditions really, and our faith traditions together, need to come together. When we first started ARC, I remember many years ago, I remember someone said, "What is it? Why do we have to do this?" And some people thought they could solve the problems in a few years. And we said, no, for two reasons. We've got to have ARC. One, because we never trust the politicians. Never, ever trust politicians because there are other interests. I don't blame them, but they're forced by other interests, like our wonderful MP that we have here, who has a lot of pressures on her, and we must pray for her. And that's why ARC must exist, but not just join the Labour Party. But also because we need to find the spiritual strength, and we're not going to find it in any one space. But if we look more deeply, each of our traditions has something to share. And on the 2nd of October, we hope to hear from people of other faiths too in this. Those of us in Reformed spaces have our own contributions to make, but we do well to enrich our understanding of God in creation with other insights. So from the Catholic tradition, from Teilhard de Chardin and others, we might be renewed by fresh understandings of the cosmic Christ. Not just the Jesus, the human Jesus, but the cosmic Christ. And from mainstream Anglicanism, not the stuff here, not least its poets, we might share in being co-creators in what George Herbert called the temple of the universe. See the universe as a temple in which God moves in love and glory. But above all, from the Orthodox tradition, we might learn in John Jesulus's words what it is to be a priest of creation rather than a proprietor of the world. A priest of creation rather than a proprietor of the world. That's the title of his essay in a book by the Orthodox called Toward an Ecology of Transfiguration. And that, I think, is part of the gift of the Orthodox tradition. Because as another contemporary Orthodox priest puts it, All of our life, our pursuits, vocation, relationships, and our creativity are offered up in communion or Eucharistic liturgy, just as all of creation was offered in the temple long ago, as Genesis 1 reminds us. And so in the communion prayer, when the priest or the minister comes carrying not only the bread of wine, but also the other things of our creativity, let us remember that the divine liturgy teaches and reminds us that all of life, say the Orthodox, is to be offered up to God in thanksgiving, and the bread and wine are their culmination and embodiment of all of our creativity. That then leads into action. For what the Orthodox say is that our liturgy says we do that, and then we take this divine life that is given to us in food and drink back into the world. What St. Maria Skobstova called the eternal offering of the divine liturgy beyond the church walls. Or in Paul Evdokimov's words, the creative and faithful priest of creation is one who makes of one's life a liturgy, a prayer, a doxology, makes of our lives a sacrament of perpetual communion. Living our lives as a liturgy of creation, as a prayer, as a doxology or creativity, as a sacrament of perpetual communion with God and all God's creations. That's our calling, and what a calling it is. To approach communion that way and live it as such Orthodox understand it is, in my opinion, therefore, to live as an artist of divine creativity, as John O'Donoghue would say, irrespective of what we believe or where we've come from or what our faith allegiance is. Recently, I was blessed in that regard to experience the current exhibition, which is called Where Shadows Meet, at the Casula Powerhouse. Using a range of art forms, this has brought together a number of contemporary Sydney artists to explore the interplay of light, shadow, and darkness. It's all there in that scripture that we heard earlier. For as our readings articulate in words, creation and creativity involve us, like God, in embracing the physical and the metaphorical spaces in which light and darkness are constantly intertwined and moving and recreating. Because creation's not back there, creation is now and always. So like our two readings today, it seems to me that we could profitably look beyond ourselves to artists who also teach us what it is to be contemporary priests of creation. So in closing, let me offer you briefly two approaches. The first is that of the Chinese-Australian multimedia artist Tian Li Zhu. In her work, Shadow Gives Birth, she explores the interface of art, science, and music. And I've got one little still photo you'll see on the front of our liturgy sheet today, but it's very still. It doesn't give you the science or the music and the movement and the play, the interplay of shadows and light and darkness. For Tian Li is particularly interested in shadow, not as elements to be shunned. Light and shadow come together in that story. They're separated for a purpose, but they're not separated. Day and night are not split off forever, and they interplay. And of course they shift. Day is shorter sometimes, longer in others. Sometimes it seems like night in the middle of the day, not just in England. They're parts of the dynamism of creativity. And for me, that's what lies behind Genesis 1 and that beautiful prayer poem for light. Because if we're to grow as true priests of creation, then like God, we need to own all aspects of existence, light and darkness, and learn to dance as joyous and kindly shadows in the uncreated light of God, which is also the dark womb from which all life and love springs. A second complementary approach which picks up that element of the darkness and the womb of life, as it were, the mother and the feminine, is Barkinji artist Madison Gibbs. Like Tian Li, Madison also explores the conjunction of darkness and light and the shifting shadows of our created and creative existence. One of her artworks involves a series of coloured figures, including mirrors, which reflect light in different ways as they turn. Rather as we do, as human beings, as priests of creation, how we catch the light, and then we also live out of the dark womb of sacred life, as we respond to the call of God in light and shadow, and join in the dance of healing and renewal. Those mirrors Madsen created, catching and reflecting light and shadow, she's called "The Spirits Are Restless." Maybe a little similar to how the Spirit of God is restless in response to ecological degradation and also in continually bringing new life to birth. As Madsen comments from her Aboriginal culture, which for so many tens of thousands of years has nurtured the original priests of creation in this land, our motherland, she's waking, she is tired, she is resting, she is restless, she is life-giver. For our warrior spirits call our ancestors and let them know that we are fighting and caring for our land and our culture. And so with the faith and prayers of those who've gone before us in the temple long ago and throughout the centuries, and with the elders and ancestors of this place, may we rejoice in God's continuing creativity and make our own offerings of praise and thanksgiving, love and care, in the name of the cosmic Christ, the sacred, ever-creative center at the heart of creation. Amen.